Good morning, everyone. Am I audible and can you see my screen?
Good morning, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's just begin then. Let me see. Or wait for another minute and then we will start. Okay, meanwhile, let me ask. I uploaded the pre-recorded lecture. You guys have any question around it?
Sir, can you please elaborate about the failed rift?
Failed rift, okay.
Yes, sir.
So what we have talked about that essentially when the rifts generate, you have three of its arms, right? So you have, because the maximum degree of freedom that is expressed in 120-degree interfracture angles, that's why you have three arms generated, right? What generally is seen that two of those arms actually work and becomes actual rift, but the third one remains dormant. That doesn't that there is not much extension around it, so that kind of opens up and then stops there. So that is what we call a failed rift.
Okay, as in the case of rift, we can have two active rifts and one failed rift. So,
Yeah.
suppose we, in case of faults and subductions, they
Hmm.
can there be any failed transform fault or something like that, like analogous to failed rift?
Well, not exactly, simply because the way such triple junctions are made, like fault and transform fault triple junctions, are fundamentally different from how the three rift, I mean, ridge triple junctions are formed. Okay. So, ideally, not.
Okay, sir.
Anything else? I hope you all had some time to review the pre-recorded lecture. Okay, otherwise it becomes a bit difficult to continue with the flow. Okay, so let's just start. So what today we are going to do is to, so we have talked about continental drift. What is that? Continental drift. So today we are going to look at uh, another very important scientific evidence around continental drift, and which is pretty quantifiable as well. Okay, and I will explain why it is called quantifiable. And here we will bring in the concept of paleomagnetism. Okay, we'll bring in the concept of paleomagnetism. Of course, we will discuss about paleomagnetism in greater details while we are in the magnetism chapter. But here I'm just going to give you a brief introduction on how paleomagnetism is used as a solid tool to prove continental drift theorem. Okay. So now suppose I am situated in Bhopal, okay? Right? And in Bhopal, I see a sequence of rocks, okay, overlying one another. Right? So suppose this rock is A, B, C, D, and E. Now, of course, this is the top and this is the bottom. So this is bottom, this is top. Now, can you tell me which rock is youngest? in most likely scenario, which rock is youngest?
E.
E, right? And how do you know that? Based on what principle you think that E is youngest?
Superposition.
Yeah. So law of superposition tells us that E is most likely youngest. Okay, there could be differences, there could be inverted sequences as well, but let's not be bothered about it right now. Let us just say it's a normal sequence and E is the youngest rock. Okay, and now let us assign some ages for all these rocks. Okay, say for example, A was formed like 500 million years ago. This is like 400, 300, 200, 100. Okay, something like that. So say around 100 million years ago, E formed. And how have we got these ages? Generally, we get ages by isotope dating. Or radiometric dating as well. This is what we call as radiometric dating. Some of the interesting radiometric dating isotopes are like rubidium, strontium system. Then you have argon-argon system. Then you have uranium-lead system, so on and so forth. Okay. How this dating actually works? Of course, I will tell you very briefly, but you will understand better in your isotope geochemistry class. Is that every of this? So this is what we call a parent isotope, and this is what we call a daughter isotope, right? So by the means of radioactivity, parent isotope is kind of decayed to something called a daughter isotope, and it takes a certain amount of time. Okay, and that is generally expressed by half-life. Okay, and then I look at a particular amount of rock. I look at a particular rock and see the what is the ratio of the rubidium versus strontium present in that rock, or uranium versus lead present in that particular rock. So we try to measure the ratio between the parent isotope and the daughter isotope, and we kind of think that the assumption is all the daughter isotope comes from the parent isotope, and hence we can simply, if we know the half-life, we can calculate the age at which this particular rock actually formed. Okay, so this is more or less the story of radiometric dating. So by radiometric dating, now I have established that in Bhopal I have a sequence of rock A, B, C, D, E, and A is oldest being 500 million years ago, B is 400, C is 300, D 200, and E 100 million years ago. Okay, and then there is another analysis that I do with the rock. That is what we call as the paleomagnetic analysis. Okay. Okay. So what we try to find out by paleomagnetic analysis is essentially, sorry. We try to find out the magnetic moment at how do I say, during the formation of the rock. Okay, So magnetic moment during the formation of the rock. So magnetic moment essentially is a vector, okay, and that vector will have two components, okay. One we call as the declination. I will define what is declination, and another is inclination. Okay. So I calculate my magnetic moment and I deduce two factors from them. One is called the declination of the magnetic moment and the inclination of the magnetic moment. Now, you know what essentially happens, that say for example this rock, this particular rock A, when it formed, it was subjected to the then magnetic field of the earth, okay. So there was a particular magnetic field which I explained in last class as well, that it keeps on changing. So the magnetic moment at the formation of that rock A is kind of inscribed in rock A, within the minerals of rock A. Not only that, so that is what we call as primary magnetism, okay. So during the formation, the magnetic moment is acquired, and that is what we call as primary magnetism. And of course, then the rock is kind of has been there till today. So there have been a lot of kind of induction of the magnetic field because of the changing magnetic field of the earth. So there is something called induced magnetization, okay, induced or secondary magnetization. So the first step of the paleomagnetic analysis is to get rid of this induced magnetization or secondary magnetization. Okay, you get rid of this induced or secondary magnetization from your rock, and that is what you do by, you know, sequentially heating your rock, or exposing your rock to alternate magnetic field. Okay, how they are done in details we will learn later on, but right now just remember that by heating and by introducing alternate magnetic field, I can simply get rid of this secondary magnetization. So what I will be left with is the primary magnetization or primary magnetic moment. So that is the magnetic moment acquired by the rock during the formation of the rock, during the formation of A. Okay, and then that primary magnetic moment, from that primary magnetic moment, I'm going to calculate two things. One is D, another is I, D being declination, I being inclination. And now let me explain what is D and I. So suppose this is the horizontal plane, this is north, this is east. So I can define a coordinate system using my north and east. And then this is Z, suppose this is the depth axis, and here is my magnetic moment. Okay, and this is, say, I, my magnetic moment. What I'm doing, I will essentially, you know, project this magnetic moment on the horizontal plane, okay, and I will measure this angle. This is my, this is, let us say this is M, magnetic moment, okay. So this angle between the between its horizontal projection and the moment itself is called inclination, or I, yeah, and the angle between the projection and the north, this is called D, or declination, okay. Now, declination is used for some other purposes, but for the time being, let us not be bothered too much. But this particular angle I is absolutely important. Why? Simply because, let us say this is the Earth. Okay. This is the equatorial plane, and here are my poles. Let us say these are my magnetic poles only. Okay. This is the equatorial plane. And then if I say, for example, I take a compass or a bar magnet, if I keep it in the equatorial zone, what I will observe that my compass is like horizontal. Yeah, this will hang in the horizontal plane. Okay, the magnetic needle will be horizontal. So that means the magnetic moment has an inclination of how much? Can someone tell me? Yeah?
0 degree.
0. Absolutely. Okay. And of course, if I am at the pole, this magnetic, the same magnetic bar will be vertical, will be vertical. So that means the inclination will be 90 degree, right? The inclination will be 90 degree. So in case of South Pole, we say that inclination is plus 90. And in case of North Pole, we say inclination is minus 90. Or other way, we can say that in this particular case, in the southern hemisphere, the magnetic needle, for the magnetic needle or for the magnetic moment, so this is the northern part. This northern part will move down in the southern hemisphere, okay? And in case of the northern hemisphere, the magnetic needle, the northern part will move up, okay? So from the horizontal, it will like move up, and in case of southern hemisphere, it will move down. And this happens in case of normal polarity, okay? So right now we are in normal polarity because the magnetic north pole is in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so hence we are calling it normal polarity. And for the same reason, what I observe that my magnetic needle in the southern hemisphere will point down, and that is what we call as inclination positive. And if it is pointing up, we call it inclination negative. Okay, this particular negative is not essentially negative. This is just a sign convention, just to understand that this is in the northern hemisphere. Okay, that's all. You don't if I have to do any calculation, I will not consider this minus value. It's just to understand that this is in the northern hemisphere. Anyway, so now what I will do, I have taken my rock K and I have calculated my declination and inclination. I said declination is important, but not at this particular moment. I am only focusing on the inclination. Okay? And then from the inclination, I can calculate something using this formula, tan I. Oof, what is that? Why not? Why is it still in the eraser mode? Just figure out one moment. Should not be. Yeah. So tan I being the inclination, is equals to 2 tan lambda. Lambda being the What do I mean by paleolatitude? I mean by paleolatitude is, while this particular rock A was formed, it was at a particular latitude, right? So say for example, I find out after I do this particular math, I find out lambda is equals to say 30 degree south. How do I know 30 degrees south? Because I know that lambda, how do I know it is south? Simply because I have got my I to be positive, right? I is positive. So that by that logic, I can say that, A had a paleolatitude of 30 degrees south. Okay. So I can so whatever the value of I is, okay, I did not explain it right. Let me just try to explain it once more. Let us say I find out the value of I is equals to plus 49 degrees. Okay. So can you just do this maths quickly for me? Anyone having a scientific calculator or with your computer? Yeah. Tan I is equals to 2 tan lambda. What will be the value of lambda? Can someone do this math quickly for me? What would be the value of lambda? Quickly, guys.
Sir, it's 29.9 degrees south.
29.9 degrees south, right? Okay.
Yes.
So let us just say for just, round it off, say around, then we can say 30 degrees south, right? Okay. So what does that mean? That when this particular rock A was deposited, okay, it was, Bhopal was at 30 degrees south. Okay. So Bhopal was at 30 degrees south. So that means, let us say, Bhopal is, say, somewhere here now, right? Here is Bhopal. Bhopal was at 30 degrees south. So maybe somewhere here. Okay. Now remember, by doing the paleomagnetic analysis, we can only talk about the paleolatitude. Okay. We cannot talk anything about the paleolongitude. Okay. Longitude is out of question. We just can calculate latitude. Okay. So say for example, here was A. That is where, 30 degrees south. So while A was deposited, Bhopal was at 30 degrees south. Then similarly, I can find out for B, maybe that was at 25 degrees south. Maybe then at C, that was at, 20 degrees, 10 degrees south. Maybe at D this was at equator, maybe at E this was at somewhere at 20 degree north. Okay, so now if I do the paleomagnetic analysis of this series of rock, I can say what I can observe, that the paleolatitudes keep on changing. Okay, the paleolatitudes of different rocks keep on changing at the same place, right? So what does that mean? That Bhopal was, where I am finding Bhopal now, was not here throughout the history of time. So during the deposition of A, it was at 30 degrees south, then it came at 20 degrees south, then came at 10 degrees south, then it went to the equator, then 10 degree north, then right now in this position. Okay, so what does that mean? That the continent that is holding Bhopal has not been at a stationary place throughout the history of time. So it has changed its position, right? And that is a primary proof of continental drift. So by using the paleomagnetic data, you can prove continental drift theory. Is it clear, guys? Or do you guys have any question? If anything is not clear, yeah, tell me.
Sir, we are doing all this analysis assuming that the magnetic polarity remains same throughout the analysis, right?
No. You don't have to. You don't have to do that. You just have to. So when you take up a rock, say for example, from B, I take up a rock, okay? And I check whether it is normal polarity or reverse polarity. If it is normal polarity, then I follow the convention. Plus means southern latitude, okay? And minus means northern latitude, okay? If it is reverse polarity, the convention is just the opposite. So till this period of time, the polarity has changed a lot of times. So you cannot assume that. You just have to see whether the polarity is normal and reverse, and accordingly you have to change your calculation. That's all.
Yes, sir. Got it. Yeah.
Got it? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Anything else? Any other question? Anything not clear to you? Okay, so now what I have got paleolatitude. I have got paleolatitude for all these rocks. A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever, I got the paleolatitude. Paleolatitude. Now, what I can also calculate, suppose, I have got a paleolatitude here, So with respect to this particular rock, where was the geomagnetic pole? Okay, with respect to this, so it's not the fixed position of the pole, it's the relative position of the pole with respect to this particular paleolatitude. So for all these intervals, I can calculate something called VGPs. Okay, so VGP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on and so forth. So corresponding to each paleolatitude, I can calculate the position of the pole. I can calculate the relative position of the pole. Okay, and this is you need to do simply because I don't know the longitude. Okay, because I don't know the longitude, I have to kind of understand where the pole was. Okay, with respect to the paleolatitude, and those are called VGPs. And what you can do, you can plot these VGPs in a map. So I can plot these VGPs in the world map. So VGP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, corresponding to A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever, you know, and I can constitute a path. Okay, I can constitute a path of the VGPs. Okay, and this is what we call as APWP, or apparent polar wander path. Okay, APWP, or apparent polar wander path. So I calculate paleo-latitude, and from paleo-latitude I calculate the relative position of the pole. How it is calculated we will discuss later on when we do geomagnetism and do mathematics around it. But for the time being, remember, I can calculate VGPs and I can plot VGPs on the world map, and I can create a map which we call as APWP and apparent polar wander path. Okay. Now, so we have talked about three kind of boundaries. You remember what are they? Divergent, convergent, and what is the third? Come on, guys. What is the third kind of boundary?
Transform faults.
Transform or transcurrent. Okay. Transform. So what happens in divergent? The plates move away from each other. In convergent, they converge with each other. At transform, they slide past each other. Now, what is the type of movement here? Dextral or sinistral? This is dextral or sinistral I have drawn.
So dextral.
How no? How do you know?
So because clockwise.
Clockwise rotation. So I put a ball here and see which way the ball is rotating, right?
Yes,
If it is rotates clockwise, then it is dextral. If it rotates counterclockwise, then it is sinistral, right? Now, in terms of magnetism, what type? I'm sorry. In terms of magmatism, what type of magma do I find from divergent plate boundary? What type of? Sorry?
Basaltic.
Yeah, I can find basaltic magma in convergent as well. But what type of basalt are they? What is the typical name that they have? MORB, you remember? You have not read, you are not reading the textbook. Guys, how many of you have downloaded Loudy? All of you? Huh?
Yes, sir.
No? Why not? I can tell you there will be questions outside the classroom, huh? As well. So you have to read the books. It's absolutely important. None of you have downloaded Loudy.
Sir, I have downloaded.
You did?
Yes, sir.
Have you started reading?
I just read the first few pages, like the first chapter, the one talking about Earth and all that.
Yeah, so you don't have to read everything there. Read the topics that I am teaching, huh? You can read the other things at your spare time, no problem. Yeah, but then just keep on reading on the topics that I'm highlighting here.
Okay, sir.
That is the first step you have to do. It's important that you do that. So it is mid-oceanic ridge type of basalt. This could be tholeiitic, okay? or almost, the type of basalt that we found here is not much differentiated. Okay, it's very what should I say, peridotitic or tholiotic. It is Mg rich. Okay, what type of earthquake do I find here in case of divergent plate boundary? Are they of very high magnitude or not, or low magnitude?
Low magnitude.
Low magnitude earthquakes. Okay. In case of convergent plate boundary, what type of magmatism do I find? Andesitic. Okay. Simply because in the convergent plate boundary, I have a lot of, there is a lot of silica input into your magma, because the continental crust also contributes to the magma. Okay. And what type of earthquakes do I find here? Moderate to high magnitude. Okay. Moderate to high magnitude earthquake. Similarly, in transform fault, it depends where they are. It's a bit of a special case. In terms of magmatism, it depends where they are. But in case of earthquake, the magnitude of the earthquakes could be very high. Okay. Now, of course, in case of divergent plate boundary, there are also transform faults. So if I look at a divergent plate boundary, okay, or a mid-oceanic ridge, what I will of course find that this is how it looks. Okay, so here are my ridges, and then of course connecting two ridges, what I will find transform faults. So here is a transform fault. So joining two ridges, of course I will have a transform fault as well. Okay, so this is how a typical mid-oceanic ridge looks like, which are dissected by number of transform faults. Okay, in case of the subduction zone, yeah, suppose here is my subduction zone. Okay, I can simply divide based on the physical strength the asthenosphere into three categories. Okay, so the very first layer, we can call it weak, mechanically weak, simply because it is very fluidic. Then intermediate physical strength, and then strong, very strong. It's almost very hard as well. So now let us, if we increase this subducting plate like this and make it a bit bigger. Okay, what I observe that generally, what happens in the weaker zone, I do find extension. Because of the slab pull, I do find extension. Yeah, and the earthquakes forming at the shallow area, the earthquake in a subduction zone forming at the shallow area, because of extension, what type of faults do we create? You have read that in your introduction to earth science classes, I'm sure. What type of faults do we create for extension? So we create normal faults. Okay, in case of shallower segment of the subduction zone, because of the dominating extension, I create normal fault. But at the very bottom, what does happen because of the strong mantle and subducting plate interaction? I do observe compression here. Okay, I do observe compression. Hence, at the deeper part of a subduction zone, I do observe the formation of thrusts or thrust-related earthquakes. We do have thrust-related earthquakes. At the deeper earthquakes that happen because of faulting at a subduction zone are generally thrust-related earthquakes because the dominant stresses here are compressional. And in between, of course, I have both normal fault and thrust-related earthquakes in the intermediate zone. Okay, so this is how in a subduction zone the earthquakes are distributed. At the very shallow part, because extension is the dominating force, I do observe normal fault-related earthquakes. At the very bottom, because compression is the dominating force, because of the interaction of the subducting plate and the strong mantle, I do observe compression-related earthquakes or thrust-related earthquakes, and in between I observe, mixed kind of earthquakes. Okay. Now, let me go back to my slide. Just give me one moment. I'll present again. Just give me one moment. Huh? Do you have any question, by the way, what I just explained? Did I cover about Euler's pole in the pre-recorded lecture? Did I talk about Euler's pole?
No, sir.
No,
No,
right?
sir.
Okay, okay. All right. So now we have understood a fair bit about plate tectonics by now. So think about one thing. Suppose we have this Earth, which is nothing but a sphere. I mean, it's a spherical body, right? on the top of which I have these lithospheric plates, right? So these plates are kind of moving. That is what is plate tectonics, right? Now, can you, I mean, physically try to understand what sort of motion would these plates have ideally? Will that be translation? Can it be translation? I mean, think about that. I have like a football. On the top of a football, I have a plate inscribed. I mean, I have a plate attached. Can I simply translate that plate on the body of a sphere? What do you think? Is it possible? It is perhaps not. Okay. So what we will see slowly, that what we will try to develop in this particular part of the lecture, that essentially all the plate motions are actually rotational. Okay, all the plate motions are actually rotational, and that rotation at different configuration, I'll give you some examples, can create all sorts of boundaries. Okay, and that was first coined by a scientist called Euler's. So Euler's fixed point theorem is actually used to explain the motion of plate tectonics. Let me read it out for you first, and I will explain how it works. Okay, so Euler's fixed point theorem states that any motion of a rigid body on the surface of a sphere may be represented as a rotation about an apparently chosen rotation pole. That is what we call as Euler's pole. So geologists have used this particular theorem to understand the motion of tectonic plates. So what happens at a boundary between two plates depends on the direction of the motion and the orientation of the boundary. In the example shown in the next slide, subduction, ridge, and strike slip motions can be simply explained. Okay. So what I said, that it's only rotation by which you can have all these type of motions. Okay. Now let us say these are two plates. Okay. So here this brick like looking area is one plate. Suppose this is the continental plate, and this blue area that is present there are the oceanic plate. Okay. Now you can see the way the boundary has been drawn is with some tricks, right? Now what we are saying, that there is only one type of motion, that is rotation. Now around this particular point, suppose there is a relative motion of the continental plate, there is a clockwise relative motion of the continental plate. Now you see what would happen in these boundaries. There will be subduction. What will happen in these boundaries? Of course, there will be divergent. And in here, in these areas, how the motion will be? Can you guess? Can someone guess what type of motion will be here?
Transform.
Transform, right? So what I'm trying to say, that just by, so what I'm doing here, I am rotating this continental plate along this particular pole, right? This area. So this I will call as Euler's pole. So I'm rotating my continental plate along this, around this Euler's pole, and depending on the geometry of my plate, depending on the geometry of the plate boundary, I am able to explain all sorts of plate motions, be it divergent, be it convergent, be it transcurrent. Okay, so now what we can do, Okay, so if I look at this particular picture, suppose this is plate 1, this is plate 2, you know, and they are kind of going away from each other, right? So we can think of like a Euler's pole sitting somewhere here, yeah, and around that pole, these two plates are kind of going away from each other by the motion of rotation. The way it is drawn here like a flat earth model, but the earth is not flat, right? So you cannot simply have translation. It has to have that rotation. Okay. So, and the pole around which the imaginary pole around which two plates actually relatively rotate against each other is called the Euler's pole. Okay. There is another thing I can. So you understand this by what I just said, that depending on the geometry, I can have different plate boundaries. Okay. Now, suppose so what I have drawn here, these are my ridges, and then there are, you know, let me just draw with a different color. These are my transcurrent faults in between. Okay. So what I can do, I can simply draw lines which are parallel to the great circle of the earth, or the longitudes of the earth, you know, along these across these transform faults along two plates, somewhere through the middle, although it doesn't really matter. And then what I will see that they will kind of meet at one point, which is unfortunately outside the screen. So they will kind of converge at one point, okay? And that essentially defines the, so if I have plate A and plate B, which are kind of moving away from each other, if I do this exercise of drawing great circles perpendicular to the transform fault somewhere through the middle, it doesn't really matter. They will kind of converge to a particular point, okay? And that point is actually my Euler's pole for this plate A and B. Okay? Any question on Euler's pole? A detailed description of the Euler's pole is also given in your in Lowry's book. So now there is another thing that I want you to remember, not just for solid earth geophysics class, but for any other class that you might, you know, around earth science, is the geological time scale. You have to remember when different events essentially happened, at least broadly. Okay, so you can see here the perspective that has been given here, you know. So we are not too much interested about the formation of galaxies and all, at least for understanding earth sciences. We will mostly start our journey from 4.5 billion years ago. That is when the earliest earth came. Very soon the earliest water came. Okay, so this part of the journey, you know, till 500 million years, Yeah, that is what we call as Precambrian. I hope you know. And then from 500 million years till today is called Phanerozoic. Okay, the whole Precambrian is broadly subdivided into Hadean, and then Archean and Proterozoic. Okay, in Proterozoic, of course, the eukaryotic cells actually appeared in life, and then you had the molecular life in the late Proterozoic. Okay, and after 500 million years, you had hard-shelled animals coming in the system. Okay, and the human lifetime with respect to the whole lifetime of the Earth is like a click of a second. It's like you can see this happened in somewhere in Miocene, and yeah, and you can further look at the geological time scale like this. So this is Precambrian, as I said, Archean and Proterozoic, and the major events that happened during those periods, say for example, and then the Phanerozoic is further subdivided into Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Paleozoic has Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous. Carboniferous has two units, Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. Carboniferous is enough for you right now, and then Permian. And then Mesozoic has Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Tertiary has Paleogene and Neogene and Quaternary. Sorry, and after Tertiary you have Quaternary. Paleogene is Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, and then Holocene. And you can see where human being comes. Okay, and you need to remember at these different stages the major events that happened. Okay, say for example, when did Himalaya start to happen? Can someone tell me? When did Deccan happen? Deccan volcanism.
Sir, a late Cretaceous period,
Late
right?
Cretaceous period. When did Himalaya start to, collide?
I'm not sure, sir, actually.
Okay. So you know that those are very important events in India, right?
Yes, sir.
So you need to find out these things, these
So
these
that is
answers.
also like late Cretaceous starting of the.
Yeah, that is when the Tethyan Sea started to close. Okay.
Yes.
The actual collision happened in mid-Miocene also. Okay. So Himalaya had different stages of development. Okay, that is also something you need to know. So what I want to mean that you have to kind of have this geological time scale in your head, yeah, because they are absolutely important not only for this subject but for other subjects too. Okay, and the major events that are associated with each of these ages. I am not asking you to kind of ratta maar lo sab kuch aisa nahi hai, but at least have a basic idea, So if I say Cambrian, how many million years does your mind, you start to think whether it is 2500 or 500? That sort of distinction should be there. I'm not asking you to remember 543. You understand my point? So that sequence of events that should be in your mind very, very clearly. Is that doable, guys?
Yes,
If it is not already with you, okay, that is something you need to do it. Okay, and of course these are the position of plates through time. You can see from late Proterozoic to early Permian. This is how things were looking, and this is what we call, these were called actually protocontinents. The Archean tectonics, the Archean plate motions are less constrained, if you like. It's not very well understood, but this is more or less how people think that it used to be. And then from, from early Jurassic 200 million years ago to present day, it is very much well understood. And this is how the plates actually move through time. Okay. Let's see if this video works. No, somehow it does not work. Or does it? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It shows the same thing. So tomorrow, I'm going to start another important, very important topic. That is what we call as triple junction and its stability. Okay, and we are going to do some mathematics around it in coming classes. Okay, maybe 2 or 3 classes we will spend on triple junction and stability. We have already introduced triple junction, isn't it? You know what triple junctions are, the different types of triple junctions that we have already talked about. Now, tomorrow we are going to dive into the details of its stability. Okay, so if you have any question, otherwise I'll just stop it here.
So there is a question in the chat box.
In the chat box, अरे ऐसे ही पूछ लो यार. Why there should be 2 Euler's point? For 2 plates, there will be 1 Euler's pole. So if I consider the relative motion between 2 plates, I will consider 1 Euler's pole. Is that clear or not? I'm trying to understand the rotation between only 2 plates. Okay, that is how I have to figure out the relative motion, right? And for that, I will consider 1 Euler's pole. Anything else? You understood now how, because of the rotational motion, I can explain all sorts of boundaries. Was that part clear? Can someone answer? Was that part clear? All right. Okay, then I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.